Did you know 58 billion US dollars was supplied by Chinese firms to the continental mining and mineral extraction industries between 2005 and 2017, representing a third of Chinese FDI in international mining operations during the review period. Chinese firms' direct investment in Africa rose despite COVID-19. 2.96 billion US dollars was invested in Africa by Chinese enterprises in 2020, up from 2019's 2.7 billion US dollar investment. The Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, in conjunction with the Africa Institute for Environmental Law, brings to you the Political Economy Dialogues on Natural Resource Governance, PEDNAG. This is an ongoing series to raise awareness and advocate for the rights of communities and conservation of the environment and natural resources. Get ready to learn more about climate change, energy consumption, local service delivery governance, responsible investments, and so much more. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
The theme for our talk this evening is Chinese financing of investment projects in Africa, impacts and implications. What's in it for Africa? Very, very topical. In fact, it's been topical for the past few years now in many countries across the African continent. And I'm sure we're going to get a lot of really great insights. Before we go into it, I will hand over to the Executive Director of ZELA, Mr. Mtuso, somebody I admire very highly, to give us just a few words to contextualize today's meeting and kick us off. So, Mr. Mtuso, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chennai, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. As Chennai has pointed out, we are delighted to welcome you to this edition of this series that the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association is conducting. We are a public interest environmental law organization that focuses on natural resource governance. We feel that to a large extent, Africa's challenges as problems in terms of democracy, in terms of good governance and sustainable development are linked to natural resources, and that by addressing those challenges, we be able to address some of the governance challenges that we are facing. So when you look at Chinese investments, I think they are part of that conversation in terms of to what extent do they contribute toward democracy, good governance, and sustainable development, or on the other hand, undermine it. So as an organization, we have a project that we call Chinese Investments that is basically looking at the impacts of Chinese investments in terms of human rights, that is basically environmental, economic, social, and cultural rights. To what extent are they helping towards the protection and promotion of human rights, or to what extent are they contributing towards the undermining of the realization of these rights? So we have been having this series, and I'm happy that today is one of those dialogues again that we are having. And our hope is that these conversations will be able to help us as society organizations, as community-based organizations, as practitioners, and as policymakers to understand better what motivates Chinese investments, what are the benefits that are associated with them, what are the challenges that are associated with them, so that we're able to program better. I think one of the biggest challenges that we faced is that while we are very knowledgeable and articulate about the impacts of Western investments in Africa, we are not very clear in terms of Chinese investments and to say, how do we hold them accountable should there be violations of human rights? And that's what these series are all about, to have a better understanding so that we know when there are problems, how do we engage Chinese investors, whether they are state-owned or private-owned enterprises. If we want to hold them accountable, which mechanisms are there at the national level, at the regional level, and also at the international level. And I hope that these conversations that we are having will help us to have that better understanding. Because as Chennai has pointed out, we can't wish away Chinese investments. They are here. Actually, they are increasing as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's imperative that we get to all these issues and find ways of dealing with them. And today, I think the topic itself is these investments and impacts and implications. And I see there a lineup that will be able to help us understand these issues better. So yeah, that's what these dialogue series are all about. And I hope that we'll be able to continue. And these are open to all the participants that may also have topical issues that they may want to discuss on Chinese investments. So as an organization, we just provide that platform. And if you have any topic that you would want us to discuss related to Chinese investments, please get in touch with Farah and we'll be able to arrange and make that happen so that we all learn and as interested and affected stakeholders as a result of Chinese investments. So with those brief remarks, I hand over back to you, Chennai. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mutuso. Thank you so much for, I think, very clearly outlining the context. We know a lot about Western investments, not so much about Chinese investments. And so this platform is here to help us unpack what that is. And I love the theme of this particular session, what's in it for Africa. So to help us, I think, delve into the discussion, I'm going to hand over now to Farah Mutondoro, who is a coordinator. And so in terms of his particular background, he's a political economist with over 10 years working experience in livelihoods and natural resource governance, service delivery, transparency and accountability, as well as anti-corruption. So I think this puts him in a really good space to really sort of create put a little bit more context to the conversation that we're gonna be having today. So Farah, I'm going to hand over to you. So Farah, if you can hear me, please feel free to unmute and open the conversation for us.
Thanks so much, Chennai. This is Farah. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I will talk about my chapter, which is a chapter which looked at Chinese investments in Africa's financial sector, put into perspective what are the implications for Zimbabwe. So I think I got a lot of learning from Veda and inspiration from the great works which Hena has been writing and many others. So thanks, colleagues. So I will speak briefly on what I call the Chinese investments vehicle and how has it been moving in Zim and in Africa at large in terms of China investing in the financial sector, but then reflect on what are the implications for Zimbabwe, what are the implications for Zambia and many other African countries. So I think the chapter is chapter 4, Chinese investments in Africa's financial sector implications for Zimbabwe. And I think I try to provide this summary that even though China and Africa has traded for a very long time, I think the relationship between China and Africa has become more pronounced post-2000. China, I think we are seeing China as a global hegemonic project within globally. I think the Belt and Road initiatives attest to that. And I think we started to see China having this God policy, encouraging its corporate actors to go out and invest outside mainland China. And there is a China-Africa policy with 5 principles. So China is quite eager to find market, to find resources, to find labor, to take advantage of Africa as a strategic partner. Then I think post-2000, we start to see changing relations between African countries and Western capital corporations, your MNCs, some of these MNCs moving out of Africa, but that space being invaded by China. More particularly, I think when I start to speak, you realize that there's an ideological shift between the Chinese developmental model, which is more around resources for infrastructural deals as opposed to royalties and taxes. So I think with China, you give them your mining rights. I think they develop a bridge, they construct a railway station and many others. So there's that shift between African countries and China, and the establishment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. So my presentation will speak more to these nuances. And so China has been investing in Africa's financial sector But China's investments in the financial sector has been overshadowed by this huge narrative, huge research literature pointing on Chinese investments in the mining sector, in the energy sector. But if you look closely, China's white paper, the 2013 white paper, it clearly emphasizes that China needs to invest in sectors that have zero emission levels, little consumption of energy, and zero pollution level. And it does underline the financial sector. And I think by the end of 2012, China's direct investments in Africa's financial sector had reached around 3.87 billion, which accounts of around 17.8 of its total global volume in Africa. That's quite insignificant, but there is growth. There is growth of that investment portfolio in Africa's financial sector. But I think when we start to talk about these investments in the financial sector, there are things which I framed as the strategic enablers that does allow China to then invest. So what are these strategic enablers that has allowed China to invest in Africa? The first thing has been the liquidity of China. So I think its literature has noted that the People's Bank of China is very liquid, huge amounts of financial resources. And starting in the 60s and 80s, there was a reform of the People's Bank of China. And out of that evolution, 4 or 5 banks were established. That is the Agricultural Bank of China, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the Bank of China, the Construction Bank of China, as well as your Exim and Import Bank of China. These banks were evolved out of the People's Bank of China, which was very liquid with huge savings of government resources and people putting their money in the bank. And they wanted to put this money out there and take advantage of emerging markets. So China then, by default, had what literature is termed as the golden triangle, which refers to a relationship that does exist between the Chinese companies, the state, and quasi commercial lending institutions. So to put into perspective, you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs pushing a narrative around go out policy. But we have Chinese corporations like your Huawei, for instance, or Chinese companies like your Sinoshu and many other companies that does exist in Africa, but with support of these quasi commercial lending institutions like your China Exim and Import Bank, your CIBC, and many other financial institutions that did evolve out of the People's Bank of China. So Chinese corporations, they undercut Western corporations once they get loans at a low credit rate from their supporting banks. So there's that coordinated relationship between the state, which is saying to its corporate entities, go out and invest. If you invest, you're likely to attract this much in terms of lending support. So this is the relationship that has enabled Chinese corporations to have this huge portfolio all over the African economic landscape. So when you talk about Chinese investments in the mining sector, for instance, these companies, they're getting loans from the lending institutions at very low credit rates or low lending rates, as opposed to what Western corporations would get from Western lending institutions. The other thing which has enabled China to move into the African economic landscape has been the FOCAC, which was established, I think, in 2000. And I think there are various goals of the FOCAC. But in principle, when it comes to the economic value, it is there to promote trade, diplomatic, security, and investment relations between China and African countries. So I think from China, it is very clear what it wants to attain in Africa. And to attain that, I think they did establish the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. So, but if you look at the 2018, was since 2000, China has committed financial resources at each and every FOCAC. And let me just run down the numbers of how much China has committed over the years in different FOCACs. 2006, China pledged $5 billion. 2009, I doubled the amount. It pledged $10 billion. 2012, it pledged $20 billion. 2015, 60 billion. Then 2018, 60 billion. We wait to see how much China will pledge to African development with the 2021 forecast. But if you look at the 2018 forecast, the financial commitment by China, it's channeling its financial resources to initiatives that pursue the goal of what it calls the China Africa Development Fund. It pledged $10 billion to allow Chinese corporations to come into Africa and invest on the basis of this financial muscle. So I think that was a huge transition from before, where China would give more money to concessional loans, but now it's incentivizing Chinese financial corporations, Chinese corporations to make use of the $10 billion and invest in Africa. So this has been the enabling framework for China to invest in Africa. But other than that, I think is the coordinated framework between Chinese entity. I would speak at length about the operations of Huawei, for instance, which has a footprint not only in Africa, but also in South America and many other countries. We are seeing Chinese lending institutions as part of the conditions for African governments to get a loan. Let's say they want to invest in 5G mobile infrastructure. As part of the conditionalities, the consumers or the people taking up these loans, there's a condition that they have to consume way technological aspects. So the loans are attached to way then providing the technological service for that loan. I think that has been the case in Zim, that has been the case in South Africa and many other countries. And I think data from the American Progress shows that I think with regards to Way, for instance, they identified around 99 loans globally where Chinese state-backed projects for the uptake of Way technology acts across 46 nations and ranging from 1997 to 2019. The total value of all these loans amounts to $14.8 billion. So China, this is a coordinated way for China to remain in business, where the quasi-commercial lending institutions, they lend the government money meant for technological uptake. Then the part of the conditionalities that Way should provide a service. So China is taking care of its own. It's providing a loan to government of Zimbabwe, for instance, to upgrade the 5G network. As part of that condition, Way should provide that service. So it's money coming from the quasi-lending institution going back to Way. So it's very much coordinated in as far as then how China does its financial investments in Africa's financial sector. But I think more interesting, I think, is the very aspect of the VC, the venture capitalists and the startups. I think data is showing that Chinese corporations, they are investing so much in VCs and African startups, taking advantage of the low bankability rate in Africa. So if you look across Africa, you realize that there are low levels of people using the formal banking channels. People are using the mobile money banking system. So Chinese corporations, they've taken advantage of that in Nigeria. They've taken advantage of that in South Africa and in Kenya. And I think I try to provide examples in the chapter. In 2016, I think there was a huge investment in Africa's VC in Nigeria and in Kenya. So now I want to expand on what has been the implication of some of these investments to countries like Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, for instance, I'll give a rundown of how the companies that have acquired Chinese loans that were attached to Way. So the first company, I think, is our very Econet, which is the largest mobile provider in Zimbabwe. Econet got a loan from the China Exim and Import Bank of China. That loan, the conditionality was for Econet to make use of Way. Besides that, I think the government of Zimbabwe through Net1 got a loan of $65 million. Again, I think the uptake of technology was supposed to be contracted to Way. Then Net1 again, in 2011, it got a loan of $45 million from China Export and Import Bank for the modernization and expansion of the Net1 service. The contract to modernize this service was awarded to Way Technological Company. So I think if you then read around and see the footing and the dotting of where Huawei is and who is doing business with, you see that China takes advantage of some of the loans that it does offer to African governments to make sure that its corporations, that they remain in business. But this is not unique to Huawei. Another company is the AFCCC, which does construction in Africa. So African governments, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, they are forced then to use AFCCC to do road construction, bridge construction, stadiums, and so forth, because these are some of the key material things from the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think what we then lack within Africa is for African corporations to find their way and tap into this existing financial platform. The Chinese corporations, they are not going to African banks to get money. They are going to quasi-commercial lending institutions from China. Once they do that, they take advantage of some of these contracts that are state-driven within Africa. So I think my chapter then speaks volume to the manner in which the Chinese are taking advantage of this. But more closely, Chennai, I think the chapter also says that China has been very clear in as far as acquisition of banks in Africa, where you see your Chinese lending institutions getting shares and stakes in some of the big banks in Africa. A case in point is in 2007, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China acquired a 20% stake of about $5.5 billion in South Africa's Standard Bank of South Africa, which is Africa's largest lender, servicing around 18 sub-Saharan African countries, Zimbabwe included. So I think it becomes then easy for Chinese corporations to send money back home because their bank at the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China has 20% equity in Standard Bank of South Africa. More closely to that, I think China also paid about $3 billion for a stake in a banking firm called Blackstone, which then helped the CDB acquire a $7 billion stake in Barclays Bank. So Barclays Bank has a footing in Malawi, it has a footing in South Africa, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Malawi as well. But why is China doing this? I think this is also attached to the internationalization of the Chinese currency, which is the renminbi, for it to avoid the exchange losses. So my chapter, in a few words, Chennai, it seeks to show that much has been said about Chinese investments in the mining sector. Much has been said about Chinese investments in other critical sectors like energy, but there's limited narration of Chinese investments in the financial sector. But what China does use is it has a very coordinated, integrated model of investing in Africa. The coordinated and integrated model allows China to create business for its quasi-commercial lending institutions, for its corporate actors. But I think the net impact then is that there are limited opportunities for African corporations then to find business. So strategically, I think from a policy perspective, when African governments deal with China, they need to protect their own corporations and find a way in which African startups, African technological companies can learn this knowledge transfer between Huawei, for instance, and some of these companies are from China. So that's my first submission, Chennai, and I hand over back to you.
All right, thank you so much for that. Such interesting insights. I think you're absolutely right. There's so much emphasis on Chinese investment in the mining sector. I mean, I've learned a lot just listening to you. I was completely unaware of, for example, the extent to which, the Chinese are now, obtaining stake in banks, right? But the point that you made around the level of coordination that's taking place within China in their effort to direct investments towards Africa and other countries as well. I mean, I'm assuming other emerging economies, I mean, is almost enviable, right? You almost wish that our governments were that coordinated, but you can see a certain level of intentionality that's not just on paper, but is being implemented. I think to me, You've given a really, really good background, I think, in terms of this conversation. The numbers that you were giving in terms of the level of commitment we've seen from China through the FOCAC over the years, I mean, is incredible. But I think you can see that there definitely is a lot of thinking and intentionality behind China's investment in Africa within the finance sector, and also, to ensure that they are supporting their own, particularly within the tech industry. So now we're going to move on to the next speaker. We have Vida No, I'm going to say it. Vida Vaidyanathan, because I've been practicing it.
Almost.
So Vida is a visiting associate fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies. Thanks for joining us, Vida. She's curated and led transnational multicultural teams and projects examining Chinese and Indian engagement in various African countries. She specializes in gathering grassroots perspectives to conduct evidence-based research to inform policy. Vida, really, really excited to hear what you say. Farah spoke very, what is that word? Very highly of you, indicating that he reached out to you to do his work. So we're very keen to listen to you. So please, over to you, Vida.
Thank you, Chennai. And thank you, Farah, for having me back in this dialogue series, and thanks to Muthuso as well. So I've actually been working with Farah and Muthuso and the team at Zela, also Josephine, I think she's here as well. We've been working together on this handbook, which I think the link will be provided shortly. And it's been a very interesting experience, especially given the pandemic, because when we planned the study, obviously we did not know about this and we didn't understand the scale of it. But now it's very exciting to be back on panels to sort of help disseminate part of the information that we've collected. But today, I think what we discussed was I'd provide like a broader sort of a geopolitical perspective, right? So I'll focus on Chinese financing of projects in Africa quite broadly, but I'll also discuss specifically the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and also the B3W, which is a Build Back Better World, which is an initiative by the US and the G7 in particular. So some of the questions that I'll ask today are, who are these financiers? Who are these Chinese financiers? Where is the money going? How much money are we talking about? And what are the instruments that they're using to disperse these funds? And what's really changed? Because like Farah mentioned, this is not a new phenomenon, right? This phenomenon has been going on for a while. So as again, he mentioned, one of the largest creditors is the China Exim Bank. And over the last couple of years, there's been a growing presence of other commercial financiers. What we understand is that when it comes to sectors, around 80%, over 80% of all of the total value of Chinese investments is concentrated in energy, transport, metals, and real estate. And even among that, a big part of the money goes into building infrastructure in these sectors. So broadly speaking, China's financial instruments in Africa is a combination of aid, trade, and investment. So when it comes to aid, from 2000 to 2019, Chinese financiers have committed over $150 billion, signed over 1,141 loan commitments with different African governments and state-owned enterprises. And a majority of these have been concessional loans, credit lines, and development financing. And when it comes to investments, some of the data sets tell us that there's over 600 foreign investment projects between 2006 and 2020, exceeding over $300 billion in value. And when it comes to trade, we know that China-Africa trade stood close to 200 billion. And the largest exporter to China is Angola, followed by South Africa and the Republic of Congo. And Nigeria was the largest buyer of Chinese goods, followed by South Africa and Egypt in 2019. So what are the broad trends we see? One, there has been a sharp reduction in official bilateral lending to African countries from 2018. This can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the debt crisis in the continent. But also the fact that the number of Chinese lenders seem to be growing. The proportion of commercial over concessional lending seems to also be increasing. Now, where does the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the world's largest FTA today, where does that stand and why is that important? So as you know, this FTA came into being after many years of negotiation. It I think it started in January 2021 officially. And the aim is creating a combined market with over 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of over $3.4 trillion. So there are a few things that literature tells us about why this FTA is important, right? What is it going to do? So one, it's going to eliminate tariffs on 90% of intra-African trade in goods. It's going to reduce non-tariff barriers, liberalize trade and services, develop mutual recognition of standards, promote inclusive, sustainable development, facilitate movement of capital and people and investments between African countries, right? And the agreement is structured in stages. So there are things like intellectual property rights and investment policies that are still blurry and that haven't really been set in stone. And so far, 54 countries have signed on the FTA. I think Eritrea still hasn't. And 36 member states have ratified it as of, I think, early this year. So once this is fully implemented, it has the potential to increase intra-African trade by over 50%. So this is a huge game changer that we're talking about. Now, why does this, what does this have to do with China, right? Broadly, in two ways it involves China. One, trade, and two, building infrastructure. So like Farah mentioned, China is Africa's largest trading partner for most countries in the continent. It provides a market for 16% of Africa's total exports and supplies 19% of its total imports. But for this free trade agreement to succeed, a lot of African scholars and scholars globally have been pointing out that the infrastructure sector in the continent needs to be strong, right? So this means building roads and ports and airports and telecommunications. And that's kind of where China comes in. And why is it important to build infrastructure? Because obviously, otherwise, African exporters have to deal with high input costs, they have high transportation costs, and also there are landlocked countries in the continent, so getting goods from one place to another becomes tricky. So this gap will provide Chinese firms who are already the biggest players in the infrastructure and construction market in the continent with more opportunities. But with this also comes certain challenges. For instance, there are scholars who say that with this trade agreement, Chinese engagement could stifle African manufacturing and supply chains, right? And why is that? Because Chinese products are often cheaper than their African counterparts. Very few African countries have the kind of capability to manufacture at scale the way China does. So if given China's footprint is already so broad, there is a possibility that Chinese imports or Chinese built products could sort of overtake markets. Now let's keep that aside. I'll come back to it, right? Stay with me. This all is going to tie in together. And then now we're going to talk about something entirely different, the B3W, right? So now why is the B3W important? And how does that weave into this larger conversation? So as you all probably know, it's this initiative that was started by the G7 in the US. But if you read the fact sheet that the White House has brought out about the B3W, it's defined within the prism of like strategic competition with China, the US strategic competition with China, right? And they are insisting, it's underlined that the projects will have high standards, that there'll be higher transparency. It's a values-driven partnership. And all of this will mean that all of this is tangentially referring to the Belt and Road Initiative and its projects, which are often criticized to lack transparency. But this emphasis sort of is important because B3W is pitched as a game changer in Africa because it's going to bring in infrastructure that's going to help the continent sort of achieve its growth, right? But one of the big challenges to it is going to be cost, because can they do it at the kind of scale and the cost that the Chinese have been able to do it? More importantly, will they be able to coordinate seamlessly between these countries, between these institutions? And also, will their overheads, will it remain competitive in the larger scheme of things? Especially because a lot of countries in Europe already have a connectivity strategy, right? So how is this going to work with the B3W? All of these questions we don't really have answers to. And most importantly, the B3W says that it's going to tap into the private sector investment in the US. And really, we haven't seen that kind of interest from American companies, the way we have seen from Chinese companies, right? So when it comes to, and all of this comes down to the larger and the very vibrant debate about the role of the African agency, right? Because, for instance, when we talk about the free trade agreement, it does not currently include a common external tariff, and which means that it leaves to each African country to decide the duties it will impose on foreign or Chinese goods, which means that African governments will need to come up with industrial policies to support their local industries and to support their local companies to build strength to compete on regional or global markets. So once these rules are discussed, foreign investors will be required to ensure that they meet the requirements so they can use their operations as regional or continental platforms, right? But what the free trade agreement and the B3W does is that it increases Africa's negotiating power, to be the ability to bargain better trade deals from different investors, including the Chinese. And this becomes really important because anybody who's been studying the geopolitics of the continent knows that China is relying more and more on Africa to support its politics. So it could be the one China policy, it could be voting in favor of China at the UN, it could even be talking about, how the BRI is a benign, it's a benign sort of vehicle and an initiative, and how it's gained support in international forums. So when it comes to the larger strategic competition, the African voice is going to be important. The African agency is going to be important in shaping how these things sort of, pan out. So right now, it might seem like these are disconnected, very separate issues, but they're really not, right? So when you talk about the free trade agreement or the B3W, there are very genuine concerns because everybody is agreeing on the fact that there's incredible promise, right? These things are going to be, in our lifetime, these could be life-changing, things for major economies. But there are serious challenges. For instance, does the free trade agreement talk about the informal sector, which a lot of countries have huge informal sectors? Will the B3W, go beyond this geopolitical rhetoric and actually deliver anything? We don't really know. But what we do know is that both of these initiatives provide African countries opportunities in varying degrees. So Chennai, what I'm trying to say is then the real question is, what is the African strategy to make most of these opportunities, right? Because these opportunities are what the world presents to Africa. Now, what is Africa going to do about it? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vida. Really, really, really interesting insights there. I think I love how you connected that. I love how you spoke about what China, well, not even before you got to China, I think essentially what we're doing on the continent, right? And how that's creating opportunities for both the Chinese, and increasingly the West now, right? And that is essentially giving Africa a type of negotiating power, right? We've always kind of sort of had it, but I think now with the AFCFTA, we have a little bit more bargaining power. But what I find interesting is that in as much as we have this bargaining power, right, to what extent can we actually use it? And I think the point that you made about the fact that with the AFCFTA, we don't even have a common external tariff yet, right? Which is, I think for me, something that would need to be a pillar, right, that highlights the level of coordination African countries are having. So I think for me, this presents such an opportunity, but I guess for me, I keep thinking, to what extent can we make use of this opportunity across the African continent? And I love the question that you posed around the B3W. I mean, I remember going through the White House fact sheet, and you can see them saying we're going to invest in the African, continent and put in place infrastructure. But, to what extent will it actually deliver anything? And I think this speaks to the point that Farah was mentioning earlier about, the really low rates at which Chinese companies can borrow. To what extent can the West, do the same? So for me, that's really, really interesting. I think it will be interesting to see how all of that outworks itself over the years to come. But thank you so much, Vida, for that intervention. We're going to come back. I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure everybody listening has a lot of questions. So thanks so much, Vida. And so now we are going to be moving on to our last speaker in this session. And her name is Hannah Ryder. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Development Reimagined. Hannah heads Development Reimagined, which is a pioneering African-owned international development consultancy with a mission for sustainable development and poverty reduction through providing strategic advice and practical support to African, Chinese, and international clients on a whole host of issues ranging from debt financing, the Belt and Road Initiative to Africa's growth markets, green growth, etc. So I'm really excited that Hannah, you are here. Very much looking forward to what you have to contribute to this conversation. Hannah, for those of you who may not have seen the program, her topic is towards an Africa-China strategy. And I think she's best placed to help us, I think, pick up from where Vida left off, right? So with this information, what does an Africa-China strategy look like? So Hannah, over to you. Kindly unmute yourself and please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chennai, for the great introduction. And it's a real honor to join you all today and also follow such great presentations and setting out the different issues that African countries, governments, stakeholders, civil society are facing, but also the opportunities, right? This is a relationship which can and should be managed. So it's wonderful to be here. Great to represent Development Reimagined, wonderful team of consultants who work on these issues every day. Best known really for our work on Africa strategy, and we recently published what we're calling a blueprint for African engagement with China continent-wide, which we hope will form the basis of kind of even national and subnational engagement with China, looking at how Chinese engagement can be better linked into the Africa Agenda 2063. But before I go into that, and I think really the substance of today, this organization and discussion is focused also on mining. So I wanted to say something about that specifically, and especially on private investment into mining. And I'll really try and focus on two aspects of the discussion. First of all, what are African countries, what are Africans getting from China when it comes to mining? Quite often the focus of the discussion is what's China getting out of the relationship constantly, right? This is, what's China's strategic interest in Africa? Why China this? Why China that? Actually, we need to ask the question, why do Africans engage, and what is that going to deliver for us? And in that respect, the second part will be focused on what more we can do in order to make the Chinese relationship fit as closely as possible to our own strategic interests, our future. Before I go into those, I do also kind of listening to this discussion. I think we need to be really clear to distinguish investment from loans. Quite often, when we talk about investment, sometimes we're talking about loans, and yes, they are linked for lots of reasons, and trade is even linked. Some of the patterns on mining are linked to loans and linked to certain types of investment. But we do just, in terms of when I speak about investment, and when my firm in the documents that we do, when we're talking about investment, we're talking about effectively equity investment from Chinese state-owned or private companies, which will never be paid back by an African government. It's actually an investment, it's moving in there. Foreign direct investment, very plain and simple. And then when we talk about loans, we are talking about concessional and commercial loans, sometimes linked to public-private partnerships. So they might involve some aspect of the government guaranteeing some private sector activity, but we distinguish those two things. We really try and make a distinction between the two, because it can get very confusing sometimes when we're thinking strategically, and I think we have to think strategically too about these things. So while the mining sector definitely has links to both, I just wanted to make that distinction based on the discussion that we've had. So what is happening in terms of China's impact on the mining sector. The first place to start is, what is the African vision for the mining sector? And there is an African vision for the mining sector. Agenda 2063 has got 6 10-year frameworks. One of them is AMV, the African Mining Vision. So this is our starting point. And when you look at the African Mining Vision, and the other 6 frameworks, the other 5 frameworks, also do have some impact here. I should mention a few of them. PIDA is the infrastructure one, of course. There's also one which is related to industrial development, which is very relevant and ties in. And then there's a building the increasing African trade, which links very well, and the AFCFTA is a key part of. So African Mining Vision was actually initiated in 2009, and it envisages a sector that shifts away from a foreign direct investment dependent sector and shifts away from being extractive to more African owned and more value added, and also dealing with issues such as environmental management. So there are some key priority issues, environmental sustainability being one, fair contract negotiations, which we've been hearing the DRC talk about more recently, very recently, all envisioned in AMV, and then also capacity building, of course, and support for small scale miners and so on also in there. And there are some particular priority countries as well. So Ghana, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Cote d'Ivoire are priority countries, but it doesn't mean that other countries cannot also pick and engage in that sense. So far, the Chinese impact, and I think Farah gave a very, very great introduction to the Chinese impact on the sector and also more broadly in terms of foreign direct investment. You know, there has been quite significant investment, as significant impact as a proportion of foreign direct investment from Chinese firms going into the mining sector. It is a significant proportion of the overall private sector investment from China that goes into this sector. And there are some projects in some of the in some of those priority countries that China has initiated. There's also some which are outside, including, for example, DRC, South Africa. A number of different projects have come into being, and it's obviously a sector which is well understood, quite lucrative from many foreign direct investment, from many foreign investors' perspectives. But one interesting thing about the Chinese perspective is also there is sometimes a link between loans for natural resources from the extractive sector to the actual extractive sector investment. So, for instance, there was the Ghana's bauxite infrastructure deal links to the extractive sector. The payments are made through the bauxite purchases, and then and the finance then that's paid for then goes into infrastructure building. Now there are pros and cons. I'm not sure whether we will be discussing the pros and cons of those different approaches. I guess we can. There are pros and cons of those sorts of arrangements, but they are, in terms of Africa's development partners, not many other development partners do that. China did do that, did benefit from those sorts of arrangements themselves with Japan years back, and so they're quite familiar with how they work and how to kind of get the benefits and manage those from a recipient point of view. But now they're on the other end in terms of utilizing them for supporting others. So there are some unique aspects of Chinese engagement into the mining sector. And in terms of that vision, what seems to be the case, and again, where China isn't necessarily unique, is that making that shift of encouraging China to invest more, and Chinese investors to invest more into the value addition aspects of mining, and engage in fair contract negotiations, is just as, if not, is just as challenging as it is with other foreign investors as well. And so the Chinese mining companies meet the same sorts of challenges that are being experienced by other investors in the same sector. So that's the area where China is not unique. So which means that in terms of meeting the mining vision, African mining vision, it's not clear that China is really meeting that vision as much as it could be, and if African governments, stakeholders put even more pressure on China and other foreign investors to do even more. So how could that be done? And this is what my firm we always try to do, right? Which is not just start with the benefits and the challenges, but also say, well, how do we move into a better situation? How do we move forward? So with that starting point of that vision, the starting point of Agenda 2063, specifically about foreign direct investment, I think there are three specific things that we can do. And again, my colleague and I, a colleague, Ika Fu, we've written a piece on this relating broadly to foreign direct investment, but I think what we've put out in that piece is very relevant, specific also for the mining sector. So first of all, the key. So I think there's three things. First of all, to have a vision, to tie into the vision. It's very important that Chinese stakeholders, Chinese government really understands what the African mining vision is, what it's trying to deliver. And it's very important for the Chinese private sector to also understand that vision. This is where African countries are trying to head to, and also understand where they can add value. Now, I talked about how China is unique in one particular way with regards to the natural resource backed loans. There's also another way that China can be even more unique, which is to think, and to some degree China already is, especially in its loan policy, but investment policy not necessarily. You see, there was a report that just came out a few days ago, which again we also inputted into, but in terms of the data, you see that foreign direct investment from China is concentrated in just 12 African countries. I mean, it goes elsewhere, but really focused in 12 African countries, which means the investment is the views about risks and opportunities and the rest of the continent are not well developed. And it's possible that China is kind of following what other private sector firms are doing, which is thinking of only a few markets being high opportunity and only going into particular sectors. If China can think and avoid what has now been called the Africa risk premium, I mean, it was calculated, and there was a report last year by the Africa peer review under the Africa peer review mechanism about the Africa risk premium. If China can avoid that, there is an opportunity to diversify the types of investments which come even into the mining sector, and think about actually bringing this added value into the investments rather than just investing at the extractive level. So that's number one. So have a vision, tie into it, and practically think differently about African risk to how other foreign investors do. Second of all, again, what we can push. We have an opportunity as African stakeholders have an opportunity to push China to do is to use special economic zones as an anchor. So in the past, many private investments have gone in and used mining as an anchor. They've used, many ports are created around the existing mining industry, and even a number of infrastructure investment projects typically go in there, even from the multinationals, multilaterals. But if Chinese foreign direct investment is tied more to special economic zones, which are doing much more of the manufacturing, broadening again the added value, broadening the manufacturing base of African countries, that will again help to create a better environment for African mining and even more economic returns. And that again will also be in line with the AFCFTA ambition to have much more trade across African countries, because they'll be trading in terms of added value. They're not just going to be trading extractives and sending them out of the continent. And last but not least, what's really needed as well, again, and this is specifically from the African side, is to really think much more, have a much more bespoke Chinese foreign direct investment attraction strategy. What I mean is, to be thinking about Chinese investors, we need to think about Chinese investors differently. We need to see why China is interested in investing in us, but utilize the kind of the narratives around, for instance, and utilize our benefits, sell ourselves better, be quite specific about what the benefits of employing Africans are. What are the benefits of investing in a country like Ethiopia or DRC, which go beyond these kind of cost of doing business indices? Chinese investors don't look at these things. They have different types of expectations and experiences. They look at things like the resource-based loans and other types of arrangements. So think more carefully, more specifically about the Chinese market as a foreign direct investment player, and tie in where we want to go in that investment and attraction strategy. Focus on making sure, for example, in terms of standards, that when we talk about the foreign direct investment standards, we're saying part of our foreign direct investment standards are about environmental sustainability, because that's going to be in your benefit and it's going to be in our benefit in the long term. You will have more risks, you will take on more risks if you don't meet those standards. So these are the sorts of things that we can do, to try to make and ensure that Chinese investment, Chinese activity in the mining sector becomes much more in line with our future vision. Thanks.
Hannah, thank you so much for that. I think it really ties together what Farah said and what Vida said really, really well. Because I think what I was hearing from you, right, is how can we make Chinese investment work for Africa, right? And I think you've given very clear and concrete recommendations. And so I really enjoyed listening, I think, to your last 3 points there, right? To what extent does the Chinese understand and buy into the African vision, right? And how can we almost ensure that that is a prerequisite, right, before investing? Potentially also looking at special economic zones that are as an anchor. I love your use of that word, right? Rather than focusing on the mining, on the extractive sector. I'll be honest with you, though, initially when I heard you say special economic zones, just coming from Tax Justice Network Africa, I cringed a little bit. But you know what? Not all tax incentives are harmful. Some of them, cost-based incentives, are actually what African countries need, right? So I think there's room to have a nuanced conversation about that. And then I love your use of the word bespoke. I haven't heard that word used in a long time, but I think having an African investor strategy, I think is so important. And I think also speaks to the point that Vida was making, right, about the fact that African countries need to be thinking a lot more collectively, to almost market themselves as a unit, right, to show the benefits of investing on the continent, right? And I think that's so important, particularly now as we enter into the AFCFTA that Vito spoke so eloquently on earlier. So we have come to the end of the different to the end of the panel session. And so we are going to open it up for questions. Some questions have already started coming in. I think some really great questions. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. Just to make it more interactive, if you are willing, I'm going to, if your hand is up, let you have an opportunity to speak. My request is try be concise and brief and straight to the point. So I'm going to go backwards. Felix, just because I feel like your question almost speaks to what Hannah was just talking to. So Felix Matasha, are you still on the call? Great.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Chennai. Yes, I just wanted to ask from Vida what really needs to be done in order to strengthen African agents, and also where are we going on wrong in terms of African agents? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Felix. So I feel like, Hannah, you could also answer that question because I think your blueprint discusses it a bit. So I'm going to point to you, and then Vida, if you want to add anything, you can go ahead and do so. So is your hand up?
On the contrary, I'd like to start because I was just going to borrow from the blueprint.
I was going to say everything.
What the blueprint said, so I'm just going to completely throw this ball to Hannah's court.
Okay. All right.
I love this. Well, so I think we need to have a joint strategy. We need to be thinking together, and it's not because I don't think it's because that China is a more complex development partner than anybody else, or China's worse than anyone else. It's just that we need to be having much more active foreign policy. And part of our foreign policy has to be about our economic relations. It can't just sit in kind of security and this sort of thing. We need to be much more active. And I think Agenda 2063 provides a really great starting point for us to be saying, how is every single development partner, to be honest, how are they living up to their support for this strategy, for our vision? Do they buy into our vision? Do they buy into in the Agenda 2063? I don't know if you've seen there's a letter, right, which is written from one of the I think it's meant to be a letter written to a child in the future. Go to the website, have a look at it. Anyway, what it says is you're in 2063 now, and I think it's maybe to. I can't remember the name. You're in 2063 and you are in the world's third largest economy, the economy of Africa. Now, do we know that? This is actually very, very underneath Agenda 2063 is this idea that Africa will be the world's third largest economy. Not sure who's going to be in front. Let's not talk about that. Who's number 1 and 2? But we need to take this seriously. And if we take that seriously, we need to say to development partners, are you taking it seriously? We say to China, are you taking it seriously? And I think actually there's good reasons why China is taking it seriously, why China actually wants that to happen, because kind of it also wants to move away from being the world's largest manufacturing hub, for instance. So there's an opportunity here. I think we need to use Agenda 2063 much more proactively, and begin at the continent-wide level and then translate that into national level as well. And on top of that, I think we can coordinate around specific issues. So we've seen DRC, for example, be saying we want to renegotiate some of our contracts on mining. I'm hoping behind the scene, and I don't know that this is happening, DRC is not one of our clients, that they're actually also speaking to other African governments about how their contract negotiations have gone. What do they have in their specific contracts in comparison to others, and how do they? Because we need to, again, constantly the focus is on what does China think? Constantly the focus is on what do the creditors think? Why are the creditors not coordinating? Why isn't China coordinating with the other creditors? No, it needs to be about us borrowers coordinating. We build our agency by coordinating with each other and sharing information with each other. This is what needs to happen. And it needs to happen both at the AU level, on the continent, and then, for example, in China, it can happen with African ambassadors in China who are based in China, a very large cohort. Similarly, African ambassadors in the US can also be coordinating. African ambassadors in Europe can also be coordinating, and actually have a much more kind of fluid but planned structural process to do all of this. And I really hope that this will happen. This is how we build.
Yeah, I think, Hannah, that's such a great response. I think, and not just, I think, in relation to China, but like you've said, right, in the way in which we're relating with all, sort of different actors and stakeholders. If we were to take a much, much more coordinated approach, I think this would address the issue that Vida was talking about in terms of actually having a bargaining power, right? It's a shame that we're still living according to the lines that were drawn back in, way then, not even by ourselves. And these lines are now, having a detrimental effect, right? Just in terms of how we move forward. So I think that was a really great response. And I think something that we need to actively be looking into. I love, for me, your first recommendation around making sure that the investors buy into our vision first, right, before they come in, I think is really key. It reminded me of, I know one of our partners, Afrodad, really just recently had a meeting, and the theme of that meeting was Africa, the rule maker, not the rule taker. And the only way we become rule makers, right, is if we come together, because as individuals, we have not very little, but much less power to negotiate. So I'm going to go to the next. Okay, go ahead, Vida. I see your hand.
Sorry, I just had to add a quick point to that.
After refusing to add a quick point.
I realized because as she was saying it, I was agreeing with what she was saying, right? And I just wanted to add, this isn't a big point. It's sort of like a takeaway from field work, right? When I speak to government officials in Tanzania or Kenya or Ethiopia, this issue would come up a lot: the issue of contract management and contract negotiation, right? And so much so that when I read reports back in New Delhi for the Ministry of External Affairs about India's Africa strategy, we get down to specifics, right? Because we have excellent law schools, and our business schools and law schools are already have scholarships in place for African leaders and all of that. So it comes down to sort of the nitty-gritties of these things, right? And to that effect, I just wanted to recommend a paper, and I'm just putting the link in here, that Paul Nantulia had written, and it's called Reshaping African Agency. And in that, he gives specific examples of how governments have been doing this. And I think he gives examples of, for instance, Benin, Botswana, Senegal, Liberia, how they've had their technical departments negotiate contracts, how in Liberia, for instance, all of the contracts are outsourced to independent international accounting firms, sort of in a way to sort of fill in the blanks when host country capacity isn't sufficient. So that I thought was a very interesting specific data point. Now that's it.
Awesome. No, thanks so much for that. I've just put the link because I think you'd sent it to me directly, so I've re-put it there. Excellent. Thanks so much, Hannah, as well, for sharing the blueprint. Okay, so I have a question that was coming from Nelson Mhlanga. Nelson, you have an aptitude for writing at length. I'm going to ask you, though, to see if you can kind of concise your questions and your points so that we can keep the conversation going. So would you like to unmute your mic, Nelson? Are you still on the call? No? Going once, going twice. Okay, it seems Nelson is not on the call. But very quickly, I'm on, but I can't speak right now. Okay, no, that's fine. I see your message. But I think one of the things Nelson was commenting on, and I think this is something that was also addressed earlier, is that, the environmental and social impacts of Chinese multilateral investments really need to be addressed, and African investment policies aligned to safeguard both communities and the environment. And I think this speaks to what Hannah was saying about get them to buy into our vision. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think something that I've always found really interesting is that China is not only investing in Africa, it's a huge investor in the United States as well, but the behaviors are completely different, right? And why is that? And so I think it's important for us to also get ourselves, together on that. And then I think these are just a couple of comments around the World Bank, AFDB. Absolutely, I think that's a conversation worth having. And then I see also a comment on corruption, etc. Okay, I can see that Frank has also written. Frank, would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead and articulate your questions? Frank the second. No? Okay. So I think he has, no, all right, no problem. So I can see that there's two questions here. Would you mind providing some context? You talk about the Chinese involvement in Zimbabwe, in the Zimbabwe finance sector or industry. Could you elaborate on this? For example, Chinese involvement on, say, asset-based finance and leasing funds, management, insurance, mainstream banking, etc. So I think, Farah, this one will be targeted towards you. Second question, you mentioned a couple of cases where Chinese were involved in Zimbabwe. I'm wondering whether these were investments or loan provisions. And I think this is, thanks Hannah for providing that distinction for both of us. But I think again, Farah, this is aimed at you. You can thank Hannah for that question. And then just a comment to the contrary. I think Frank is saying that accounts are emerging, suggesting that China is not a monolithic, well-oiled and highly oiled when it comes to execution of its relations within African countries. This is because of competition between and among SOEs and POEs, provincial versus central governments. So what I'm going to do is ask Farah if he can respond to questions 1 and 2. And then Vida, I'm going to ask if you can speak directly to what Frank thinks is actually contrary in terms of what's happening in the African continent and the way in which the Chinese are engaging. So Farah, over to you.
Thanks, Chennai, and thanks, Frank, for those questions. So I think in response, Zimbabwe is missing out on this huge financial flow from China, because I think the financial sector in Zim is crippled due to hyperinflation. So the Chinese are also eager to invest in the financial sector in Zim. When you compare Zim to South Africa, Zim to Nigeria, vis-a-vis Chinese inflows in the financial sector, it's not as lucrative to entice the Chinese. So the implications, I think in 2018, the president invited Chinese banks to invest in Zim, but there's limited uptake of those investment opportunities. So I think the chapter then says that if we do not resolve the broader economic governance issues, we are going to miss out on these opportunities, especially at a time when you're saying Zimbabwe is open for investment. We cannot harness and take advantage of the financial sector. So you look at countries like Dubai, for instance, I think they are transiting the economy to service-based. You look at Botswana, I think it's very liquid. DB has moved its financial headquarters to Botswana. So I think the banking sector in Zim is not as lucrative to entice the Chinese. But what they've done, I think, like Yana said, is to provide loan conditionalities. They've provided loans to Zimbabwean corporations, your Econet, your Net1. But besides that, I think they've also provided financing to mining sector projects like one in Wanke, to Net1, to Econet and many others. So I think that's where my comment was. Coming on to the issue of the Chinese not being as organized, I think we should not lose sleep over how they are competing amongst themselves, but worry more about how can we build a vibrant financial sector in Zim, in South Africa, in Malawi and others, where you have not only the Americans, but also the Chinese investing. So to the very fact that China acquired a stake of $5.5 billion in Standard Bank, I think it resuscitated that bank. So we need the same for our banks that are under decline in Zim. That will be my response. The other issue which I wish to speak at length is the issue of African fintechs and the startups, where again for Zim, I think due to the demographic dividend, when you compare ourselves with with Nigeria, I think we do not have as much demographic dividend, but I think it's a space where I think government policy needs to propel young techs to take up this space, so that I think we see a lot of VC, venture capitalists, coming in to buy some of these ideas and innovation. Over to you, Chennai.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Farah. Vida, do you want to comment as well on that last one? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually something that we talk about a lot, because often people talk about China, right, as this huge monolith, but it really is, there are so many layers to it. And it's understandable why, one would argue that there is a coordinated sort of an approach, and it's not completely incorrect. Like, for instance, I recently wrote about a Zanzibar airport project where you clearly see the state-owned enterprise and financial entities, they all seem to be working in tandem. So there are, of course, instances where SOEs work together with banks and so on. But largely speaking, I agree with Frank that it isn't as coordinated as it is made to seem. Sometimes lines are drawn to make it seem like this grand strategy that's playing out, when it really isn't. And you would actually be surprised how much of control that the central government does not have when it comes to entities in Africa, right? Because a lot of them, for instance, when I speak to like Chinese pharmaceutical manufacturers who are setting up shop in Ethiopia, in Gelan, or I'm speaking to Chinese miners in the copper belt in Zambia, or I'm speaking to, these agricultural firms that are using artificial intelligence and drones in Zambian agricultural sector. These entities don't really have much to do with, let's say, some of them haven't even heard of the BRI. Some of them don't really know about China's grand strategy in Africa. These guys are there to make money. They're there for business opportunities, right? So I think the idea that all of this is sort of puppeteered or coordinated by the party or by the central government is I think it's a narrative that just exists. I don't think that's really true, because like Frank mentions in his question, there are provisional governments, there are independent mom and pop shops, there are entrepreneurs on varying degrees of scale with varying amount of resources at their disposal. So I would sort of push back and say that that isn't really true, and he's right. Also because a lot of the SOEs I interview in China, their biggest competition are other Chinese firms, right? So they're really competing against each other to get the deal. So I would sort of agree with Frank and say that there isn't really a larger China strategy for Africa. It really depends on whose China you're talking about. Who is this person who is a specific entity you're talking to in this particular context? Because again, African countries are so different from each other, sectors are so different. So, you can't really generalize when it comes to that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Vida. I think I just mentioned in the chat that Hannah is going to be dropping off in the next 10 minutes. So if anyone has any specific questions, particularly related to the mining sector where she spoke to, I think go ahead and put them in the chat right now. Hannah, I have a question just before you leave us. I think I really, like I mentioned earlier, liked the 3 recommendations that you had. But for me, the question is now, how do we do that? Do you know what I mean? Like how can we get our African leaders to start working together? Because like I mentioned earlier, it's not only in our engagement with China, but it's in every single various platforms where you'll have a picture of the Chinese president alongside 50 different African presidents, right? I've always found those quite interesting. So I'm curious to sort of know that the practicalities of the recommendations that you've put forward. I'm sure there'll be a lot more information in the blueprint around this, but keen to hear your thoughts about that before you drop off.
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity. Obviously, we have the African Union, where our heads of state go, or at least now online, meet annually. And then there are, and specifically with China, of course, there's a every 3 years there's the Forum on China Africa Cooperation, and to date that is not highly coordinated across African countries to date. So FOCAC has existed since 2000, as Farah was explaining. And to date, every 3 years, each country comes with its own kind of plan, and there's a series of bilateral meetings as well as the larger meeting. And that's coordinated in terms of, we know who's going to be talking after the next, which president's going to be speaking after the next president, but it's not necessarily coordinated in terms of, these are the substantive positions that we're coming with. We want to, we've been lobbying China to do, this amount of concessional financing in Africa, or, and it's not easy either, because there's also mixed messages, right now, just right now, for example, in terms of concessional finance, we have, some African countries kind of feeling the heat of debt distress, and whether they are actually in debt distress or not is still subject to a lot of further analysis. But they also need more financing, and the Chinese own kind of domestic situation, like Vida was talking about, constrained in lots of different ways. So it's difficult to come up with a position. It is, but nevertheless, it is possible. And in terms of, the African Union now has a representative in China, for instance. I've had one since late 2018. He's pretty active, and there's also an African ambassadors group in China. So there are mechanisms, and there's even the possibility of making something which is even more kind of actually even more coordinated through the African Union potentially. But I think what we need to do is be inspired, right? Be inspired by what we've achieved in terms of AFCFTA, which was a big deal. And yes, we still have ratification processes going on, 38 countries, it's now not 55 actually gone through the parliaments. But that's, it's a massive difference for us. And so much, and it really signifies that kind of intention to move ahead. I think also what we've had through COVID, and what we've seen through COVID, is that coordination really makes a difference. Had the African Union, had the African CDC not been around to help African health ministers kind of think through what their strategy for dealing with COVID would be, especially at the beginning stages, especially through 2020, that would have been terrible outcomes. Even, it's obviously a terrible outcome for us, but even more so. And so coordination does have power. And I think we can encourage and say to civil society organizations, think tanks, etc., just show what kind of power that does have, how the outcomes are much better for us, and use some specific instances. Like I mentioned, DRC. Why is DRC now currently talking to others about these issues? We've got a new president in Zambia. How is that new president in Zambia now working with others in the region to be talking about these things, about the questions around Chinese debt, for instance, and the overall debt for Zambia? Is that coordination happening? So I think it's holding leaders accountable for coordination, not just for things like the traditional kind of corruption, etc., but encouraging them to do much more coordination, and regionally in particular, sub-regionally also.
Yeah. I just realized, because actually Obert had asked a question to say, to what degree can we, I'm just reframing it now because I've lost it, but he was saying, to what degree can we expect others to buy into our vision if we haven't bought into our own vision, right? And I think that was, I want to see if I could find it somewhere. Literally, to what extent do African countries buy into their own vision and work together to achieve them, right? So I think that's one question. And then, how can, without reliance on external actors. So I think that was his question, which I think speaks to what you've just said. But yeah, if there's anything else you want to add quickly before you end, happy to hear
it is just to reiterate that it's to have Agenda 2063 at the forefront. We really need to and have that accountability and push for that accountability. It's not about accountability to creditors, not about accountability to external actors. It's about our own internal accountability to each other as Africans.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it. And hope to keep in touch and touch base at some point.
Sorry, I had to leave a bit early, but thank you again. It's a great opportunity, and thank you to everyone for their great questions, and thank you for Ryan Vida also for excellent presentations in advance, and Chennai, great moderation.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so I can see there's a couple of questions coming in, but I've seen Claude's hand. So hi, Mr. Kabemba, how are you? Could I ask you to unmute your mic and go ahead and ask your question?
Chennai, thank you so much, and great conversation. I just want to ask, being a little bit controversial, isn't too much, we're expecting too much from Africans to unite on the issue of China and have a common approach to development. Our countries are at a very different level of development. I know when you take Democratic Republic of Congo, you take Ghana, you are talking about two different countries with two different set of objectives, short, medium, and long term. Maybe should we, because we've been talking for some time about Africa sticking with one voice, building a unity when they engage China. Isn't it time we start looking at the capacity of each country to really engage China? My sense is that look at Rwanda. Rwanda is doing very well on its own in engaging China, engaging the United States and the EU. Isn't it about the capacity of the state on its own to do what is right, and implement its development plan? I thought just to hear a bit of comment on that.
That's a really great question, and I can see Vida is ready to respond. Go ahead, Vida.
No, I think honestly, Farai and Mutuso, and maybe even you should comment on this. But before any of you, intervene, I just wanted to say I just didn't think that that's a mutually exclusive. I think it's a process that has to happen on two fronts, because as you already probably know, China deals bilaterally with countries, right? So even when it came to debt negotiations, they said, we're not going to talk about things as a whole, as an entire African Union entity. We're going to deal with these countries bilaterally. So I think it is without question that if you look at Chinese footprint globally, that countries themselves will have to create and stick with and pursue a China policy for many reasons. But at the same time, given the FTA and given where Africa stands, and given that collectively that there is a certain amount of bargaining power to be demanded, it doesn't mean that then countries stop to bilaterally engage China. I just don't think that this process is mutually exclusive. I just wanted to say that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Vida. I can see that Nelson indicated that he agreed with Claude. So before I go to Farai and Mutuso, I think let's listen to Nelson and then come back to responses. Go ahead, Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chennai, for being patient with me coming on board.
No problem.
Nothing fancy or no special or violent objections or contributions, but I really do agree with Claude. And in as much as we do have all these, agendas, policies, and documents being drafted with the AU name, it would be naive of us to believe that, all 53 countries or all 54 of them are actually going to buy into this whole, the whole African Union ideas that we push across. And a closer example would be Tanzania. I think, Claude, you'll be well versed with this one, where they refused Chinese investment, but then just recently, they actually moved into a middle income economy without Chinese investments. So I feel it's more of what do we do in our own playground thing? And if nations take it upon themselves to be like exemplary or leaders in Chinese or Sino engagements, I think that there are quite good examples. I think Claude gave Rwanda as a specific example, which is, trying to do or map its own way or its own model regarding how we, engage with China. But I feel, some of these issues, I think building or going a step deeper, have to do also with Western foreign policy towards African countries. And as you recall, these are not the same across all African countries. Take, for instance, Zimbabwe. I think Zimbabwe is a special case. We are special people down here. And I would like to think that, the reason why we move towards less stringent loans from our Sino friends is because of, issues to do with economic sanctions, could be issues to do with, engagement, diplomatic relations, which is some of the issues I was raising in my earlier rants, if you can call them that. But there is vast opportunity to actually, streamline and mainstream all these Sino engagements, environmental and social management frameworks into Chinese investments in Africa if we put our minds to it and if we take charge of the whole process. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Nelson. Yes, so Farah, I'm going to hand Claude's question over to you, and then Muthuso would be very keen to hear your thoughts as well. Farah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chennai, and greetings, Cloud. Well, I pretty much agree with Cloud, because I think if you look, I think recently data is showing that China invested around $2.96 billion into the African economy, but which went to 12 African countries, your Zambia, your DRC, your South Africa, and your Angola. So I think the way in which the investment is going then, I think in a way it defies the whole logic of convening 53 countries to have a common agenda. But nonetheless, I think China is also has a footprint in Zim and many other countries. So I think for the sake of the BRI, for the sake of the China-African strategy, and for the sole purpose of having the Africa Union and the Africa Mining Vision Cloud, I think there's some need for some convergence by African countries to pursue a common goal, especially when we start to articulate issues around the Africa Mining Vision, as Yena was saying. So I think the commonality of the issues, I think it depends on the sector. For instance, when it comes to mining, I think we need that. And for the sake of the AFCTA, I think there is that commonality which is required. But I think going forward, bilateral engagements are required. But I think the other issue is around capacity, because I think Yena was speaking about capacity. Do some countries have that capacity to negotiate contracts with Chinese corporations? So I think beyond the convergency, there is need for building that capacity in our policymakers and governments to negotiate better individually with the Chinese. I think Muthuso can also take it.
Awesome. Muthuso, we'd be keen to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I was wondering what I could add after listening to Dr. Kabemba, who is one of my mentors. Yeah, but I agree with Veda that I don't think there is that these two approaches are mutually exclusive. I don't think we can say we don't need the African Union, for example, and that we need to do it individually or vice versa. I think these actually reinforce each other. I think when you look at the African Mining Vision, for example, it's a framework that is there that we can use in terms of engaging Chinese investments. But these may need now to be further refined at the national level. And after all, the African Mining Vision is very clear. It is at that level, and it has to be implemented at the regional level and also at the national level. So when you come to those stages, that's where you can actually define what is more relevant to you as a country. So for me, that vision in itself is not in any way a weakness in terms of the engagement of the Chinese investors. So that should actually be an extra, I think, that leverage that we have in terms of engaging Chinese investments, but largely shaped by our own needs as a country at the national level. So for me, I see that there is nothing wrong with all these approaches. They actually reinforce each other. Then there was this discussion in terms of capacity to negotiate. I don't know whether it is the lack of capacity or whether it's deliberate. I'm saying that because when you look at the African Development Bank, I think they've got that African Legal Support Facility that can actually help countries to negotiate better deals with Chinese investors or any other investor for that matter. But if we are to do an analysis to say how many countries have approached the African Development Bank to utilize this facility, you see that none, including my own country of Zimbabwe. So that failure to negotiate, I wonder whether it is something that is deliberate, because we can't say that the capacity is not there. if it is not there, but there are people that are ready to offer that capacity. But why are we not approaching them to get that support? So maybe we tend to see more benefits in terms of negotiating in our weakness rather than using those tools that are available. So if that is the case, then even this notion that maybe we can negotiate better as a country rather than under the auspices of the African Union, I think for me, it is very problematic, because we see that even when we have those opportunities to utilize the resources that are readily available, then we are failing to utilize those. So for me, I think that there are greater problems. And I like the way how Veda and Hannah also were framed to say, look, it's time we stop blaming other people and begin to look from within to say, what are our problems? Because that's the starting point, admitting those weaknesses that we have in our problems, rather than start by blaming China. China is just like another investor. I mean, they see an opportunity. If you are weak, then that's your problem. I mean, we all do that. We negotiate what is in our best interest, even at an individual level. So China is not wrong in terms of what they're doing, in terms of negotiating for what they see as being best for them. It's also our responsibility as Africans to say, how do we negotiate what is better for us? So I think it's high time that we stop blaming other people and start by inward looking to say, what is the problem? What do we need to do so that we are also able to negotiate and compete better? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mutuso. I think you raised such a great point in emphasizing what I think Vida and Hannah had said. I think in as much as we may want to, hold China to account, there is also an internal accountability that we need to be ensuring amongst ourselves. Vida had also sort of asked, my thoughts around, Claude's question. Claude, I think it's an excellent question, but I think for me, again, agree with what Vida said. They're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, because I was thinking about the AFCFTA and various other agreements where you have sort of a key objective in mind, but then have provisions, right, that allow for countries that are at different levels of development, right, to eventually attain that, right? So for example, because I come from a trade background, we're talking special differential treatment, for example. So keeping the goal at, the same, but allowing for different, I guess, almost levels of accountability dependent on your developmental growth pattern, etc. Nelson, I can see that you've raised, I don't know if that's a re-raise or the same hand. Did you want to add something?
It's a re-raise. Fortunately enough, I can now speak. So allow me, like all those words, I'm not going to be putting them into words. I think, Cloud brought up a really, he stirred up a hornet's nest. And I'd like you to refer specifically to, is it Metusa? Sorry, who just spoke now. Yes, thank you. There may be like, the help available from the African Union. The structure is there. We are there, the African Union, to help African countries, capacity building and everything. But you rightly point out, which brings me back to exactly what Claude said, that we really, the institution of the African Union is really not as solid as we, as the name sounds. It's a fancy name, it's a fancy institution. What it stands for is right, but then they're not really the panacea to everything. And we, as the people, I think, the nations themselves really do have a part to play. I'm just thinking of an example, most recently, we are in the process in Zimbabwe of establishing and developing the NDS1, the National Development Strategy. And it would be, I'm just curious, how many of us have contributed specifically to that document? I know consultations have been called out, and there is vast, talk about investments, infrastructure, looking east, because definitely, the Western foreign policy towards Africa or towards Zimbabwe is not really that friendly. But just a personal question. We are saying that nations need to take the onus on themselves, but then nations are made of people, not just the policymakers. How many of us here, or what are we doing on a personal level, which is outside our professional capacity? It's just a Muvunzonando kind of thing in Shona, just something to take home. An example, there was Chinese extraction, mining activities which were planned to happen in Hwange National Park. Very very few people. Yeah, the extraction and the fracking wasn't done, but not many people really, responded to the environmental outcry or the impacts, the adverse impacts that were being caused by that project. So it's just something to ponder on, and it just felt like saying it asked. Thanks, Sinai.
Yeah, because it sounds to me also, in addition to, the accountability that we feel African countries must be having amongst themselves, you're actually bringing it to an individual level, right? In terms of what are we doing as individuals, as Africans, No,
I just remembered something funny. In Zimbabwe, we had a minister who went up and beat up some owners of a Chinese factory just outside Harare on our way to Norton. I'm not sure if you heard about that. So the social, the community aspects of these investments, the social implications also need to be looked at. And he took it at a personal level. Mm-hmm. But what I feel that did is that, well, his name is Honorable Temba Mliswa. But what I feel that did is that it actually it raised the concerns which are quite important about how Chinese investments, Chinese businesses are treating people, how they are also treating the environment, which is, the little things that we do from a personal capacity, they do go a long way.
Great, fantastic. Thanks for that. And I think that's why we have institutions such as Zela, for example, right? To do the work of public awareness raising, to host sessions such as this, to get individuals interested and also participating in these processes. I am keen to hear, Claude, just because, to use Nelson's word, you were the one who stirred the hornet's nest a little bit. Some of your thoughts in terms of the feedback to your question. And then as we're wrapping up, I will then hand over to Farah and Vida, and then give it over to Mutuso to close up. So this is just for you to start thinking about your closing remarks. But Claude, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts.
No, Chenai, thank you so much. Just as I said, I wanted to be a bit controversial.
Which you were.
I just want to I'm a proponent of African regional integration. Mm-hmm. I sincerely believe that it's important for African countries to work together. Mm-hmm. First of all, to build African interrelations and build Africa inter-trade relations. So that is one. But I also want to say I agree that the two are not mutually exclusive. They can work together at the same time, simultaneously. I was thinking we seem to forget that countries privilege first their national development plan before anything else. They will tend to push national development plan. And the AU is got a 2023 vision from which countries draw draw information to build their national development to align it to the AU. But my point was, I totally agree with all colleagues who have spoken. I think the points are quite correct. I was talking, the African Union is as strong as its members are. And the fact that the African Union vision and push most of the time never brings back very positive pathways for the continent is not because the AU is weak, because the members are weak. And that weakness is reflected in the manner we negotiate with China. And it's not the AU weaknesses, it's member states' weaknesses. I totally agree with Vada, I think, who spoke about China having bilateral relations with African countries. But it's exactly at that level. If we are going to build the African Union strength, we must build from below by building the capacity of African states, first and foremost. One, to be able to implement their own proper policies. You can't implement if you don't have a vision. You can't negotiate if you cannot maintain your vision. So my sense is that I'm simply arguing for a much stronger country level vision which is linked to the African mining vision. We are in case of mining, or to the 2063 agenda for a much broader developmental issues. You can't expect a country like, I take most of the time, let's take Somalia, to fit and to respond effectively to the African Union agenda and vision when it's so weak internally. So I was talking about the capacity of the state, the African state itself first, as a key problem that we need to solve. And China uses those weaknesses. When you see 54 head of state in China line up, China is not looking at all of them. China is picking up where it wants to invest because of its interest. And we cannot prevent China from doing that. But the question is how prepared these countries like the DRC, which is a very important and strategic country for the African continent, how can we help prepare the DRC, or the DRC itself prepare itself to engage China at a level where it's draw maximum benefits from its relationship with China, and that benefits from China through the DRC can expand on the continent. So I'm calling from a bottom-up type of engagement, but I totally agree. They are mutually beneficial. They're not mutually exclusive. They are all important. Regional integration is critical for Africa, but we need at some stage to agree, at some level to agree that we have very serious problem at the national level that we need to quickly build. The Zambian case with the energy that has come up with the election of the new president needs to be utilized and capitalized on to start rebuilding the state. Because the new president, the relationship and the debt issue that he has, it will not be solved by increasing just the production of copper, which I've heard. They need to diversify. They have to be able to capture revenue from different angles of the mining sector, for example. Just taxing, it's a very narrow base to collect revenues. That's why we are saying, why don't you push the Chinese companies in Zambia and West African companies to start thinking and investing in local in linkages. We have, the case of Botswana, convincing De Beers to come and cut and polish diamonds in why can't we do that?
Exactly.
So my sense is that there is, first and foremost, we can't build an African Union when we've got nothing in common, when we've got nothing to share. If we are going to build a trade, intertrade relations, we need to have some goods to trade. And for me, that I think is the more powerful ways we can do it. But I'm not disputing the importance of building, of also having the AU pushing for a common agenda, which I believe in. Thank you, Janai. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thanks, Claude. No, that was great. So I'm going to ask Farah and Vida, just because we're running out of time. You have about a minute to give sort of your closing remarks. And I have been reminded that there was a question just around, it says here, we speak of Chinese state actors. What of the private Chinese players, right? In the case of Zimbabwe, what is the scale and extent of private Chinese investors? Maybe Farah, you can pick that up as we close. So Vida, over to you, about a minute or so.
I must say I really did enjoy Claude's interventions, and I'd also say I wouldn't really I disagree with Nelson, because I wouldn't really call it a hornet's nest, because these are I think Claude brought up really important questions that need to be asked, and especially questions regarding state capacity, individual capacity. And I think with especially about China-Africa relationship. It's so interesting because this has really captured the imagination of people, right? You have heads of state in like Western countries altering, or not just the Western countries, other countries other than China, altering the way in which they've dealt with countries in Africa because of how China is going about things. You have journalists who are, more papers are sending in journalists to the field to, file reports from the ground. You have an entire academic subfield, which I kind of belong to, which of researchers and scholars who only examine what China is doing in Africa and what does this mean. And you also have like individuals like civil society organizations, like what the kind of work that Zela is doing. It's so important, right? Because you're holding African decision makers accountable. You're also generating information from the grassroots so that you're not just, stating things that have already been said. You're trying to find new knowledge sources, but also individuals like I think I remember I saw a show in Kenya of this artist called Michael Soy, and his entire collection was about China, Africa. So I think, but we sort of shouldn't lose sight of the larger question, which is China isn't the only actor, right? Because if you sort of step back, Western countries who have been colonial powers in the past still have a humongous footprint in the continent, right? And then you look at countries in the ASEAN region, like Singapore, Malaysia, even countries like Turkey, India. There are so many other developing countries that have investments or interests in Africa. So I think it comes down to the question of at each level, right? At each level, at the individual level, at the state level, at an institutional level, at a civil society organization level, what can you do to strengthen your societies? And that applies to not just African states, it applies to India. Like it's a country that deals with a lot of developmental challenges too. So this conversation is in a way a global conversation in the global South, right? So this is sort of, so I know that if you just sort of stepped away from today's conversations, it looks like the China-Africa elephant in the room is completely changing dynamics of how everything is done, which isn't entirely true. It is an incredibly exciting phenomenon and which we should all pay attention to. But I think there are fundamental questions that developing countries in Africa and countries like India have to first deal with. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Vida. Farah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chennai. So I think my concluding remarks, I think it's a fact that Chinese investments going forward, they're moving towards Latin America. And I think we need to reflect on what is the net impact of that. And I'm happy to invite Cloud in the next dialogue to reflect on that as we reflect on FOCAC. But I think to also think through the very fact that I think more of that investment, $13 billion, is going into construction. Mm-hmm. So there's this overemphasis on mining and putting limited focus on finance, the financial sector, and the construction, where I think, like I indicated earlier on, China coordinates the way it does business, where if it gets a resource-backed loan, I think then they will, as part of the conditions, a Chinese company needs to get a contract to develop the Kazungula bridge, for instance. So I think we need to broaden our lenses and our focus in how the Chinese business model operates within Africa. Then there was a question on Chinese private companies. So what we are doing within Zela is we have developed a data visualization tracking site. It's under development as we speak. So the idea of the site is to track each and every Chinese company that is operating in Zimbabwe. There are quite a lot, but there is no central point of information to profile who is who and what violations they have done in communities and what they are mining and what are the community concerns. So we're trying to come up with this innovative idea of providing that information and allow communities to air out their grievances that we have these concerns about these companies so that we profile them. But I think the idea for us is to grow it from a local initiative to a more regional initiative connecting Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and South Africa, and track some of these private mining companies for the sake of accountability. Thanks a lot, Chennai.
Thanks, Farai. So thank you both, Vida, Farai, and Hannah in absentia for really what was such an insightful conversation. I'm now going to hand over to the Executive Director, I think, to give us some closing remarks. I know we've gone 1 minute over, but we can't end this conversation without hearing from you, Muthuso. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Chennai. I think let me start by thanking you for the able facilitation. I think that has enabled us to have this lively conversation, and that has also been able to bring out the issues that relates to Chinese investments. Let me also thank Veda for her insights. She was heavily involved in terms of the research itself, and she was the supervisor, I think, supervising Farah, Josephine, Eve, and Prolific. And it's evident that she is someone that is very knowledgeable in terms of Chinese investments in Africa. So thank you very much again, Veda, for agreeing to participate. Then, of course, Farah, thanks very much for your insights as well in terms of Chinese investments from a financial sector perspective. And lastly, I would like to thank all the participants that joined us. As we said, this is an ongoing series in terms of these investments. And as I pointed out at the beginning, this is a platform that is open to everyone that has got an interest in these issues. So if there are people out there that feel that they may have some interesting ideas to share about Chinese investments, please approach Farah, and we would be happy to have you as one of the panelists in terms of discussing various facets of Chinese investments. And of course, I know Farah has already hinted that Dr. Kabemba will be in the hot seat in the next dialogue. So we look forward to his perspective. He's someone that has worked on Chinese investments for a very long time, and he's also a thought leader in those issues. And of course, we hope to continue our partnership, Chennai, with Tax Justice Network Africa in terms of this series. This is an area that you also work on a lot, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to exchange views. So I would like to thank you all, for taking your time and for participating and for sharing your views. It's evening here in Southern Africa, so good evening. I don't know in Asia what time it is now, but and also in the US, I think it's still in the afternoon. So for those that are beginning their day, all the best, and thank you very much. And back to you, Chennai.
Thank you so much, Mtuso. I think on that note, there's nothing more to add. Just to say thank you again for joining us for this conversation. Really, really insightful, and looking forward to the next talk. Have a good night, everybody. Vida, enjoy the rest of your day.
That was one of the political economy dialogues on natural resource governance, PIDNAG, brought to you by the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, and the Africa Institute for Environmental Law. For more information, please check out www.zela.org or follow the African Institute for Environmental Law on Twitter at AIEL_info. Stay tuned for more episodes.